Shantae Half Genie Hero came to Kickstarter back in September 2013 and raised $776,084, but that number climbed to over $900,000 over the years thanks to Slacker backers. After many delays, the latest Shantae game finally debuted recently on December 20th, 2016. With nearly $1 million worth of Kickstarter money behind it, you have to figure it's good, right? Well, not necessarily, because $1 million is an incredibly small budget for a video game, plus you have to subtract the amount developer WayForward spent on Kickstarter fees, taxes, shipping rewards, paying staff, and on and on and on. And really, budget is no indication that the game will be good anyway. Still, we can at least see if the final product lives up to what was pitched, right? Instead of a normal game review in which I complain about how terrible a game is, then give it a 9 out of 10 anyway, how about instead we do something different? Clickist is all about crowdfunding, so what if we instead compare the final product to what was first pitched on the Kickstarter? Anyone who's seen our Kicked episode on Shantae will know the campaign itself was pretty impressive. There was, however, one big question hanging over it, which unfortunately hasn't really been answered, but we'll come on to that later. For now, let's take it from the top of the Kickstarter page, where free backer exclusive DLC is already promised. This was added after it was already a success, you see. You'd think this stuff would be in the game from day one, but for some baffling reason, it's not. WayForward posted an update stating that the stuff is coming later. It's the first in what I think are several examples of misplaced effort and focus. I should also point out that, judging from the original pitch video, it seems like development was already underway when the Kickstarter page went up. We see several minutes worth of gameplay, likely from a prototype or even pre-alpha build. While there are some changes, most of the gameplay features and levels look more or less the same, so don't expect too many differences between what was pitched and the final game. Oh, I guess that's technically a spoiler for the video, isn't it? Huh. The first original section of the page is titled Meet Shantae, and pretty much just talks about the pre-existing series. Anyone familiar with Shantae should be familiar with this, like dancing in order to turn into different creatures with different abilities, the platforming, exploration, and that kind of stuff. It's in the Adventure Begins section where we get the first substantial bit of information about the new game. It gives us a summary in the start, talking about Shantae being woken up one night by a mysterious voice. Everything described in the passage happens at the start of the game, so they obviously knew that's where they wanted to start, and we even get a glimpse of Shantae in her sleepwear at night in the pitch video as well. The first real difference between what was pitched and what's in the final game, if you can even call it that, comes from the next section, Game Breakdown. It begins by saying, as the player, it's your job to find the source of this new evil power, with the evil power being described in the last section. There is a new evil power, sort of, but not really. It's something that really only comes up at the very beginning with that voice, and then at the very end. To me, this line implies a continuous, overarching narrative, when really it's more of an episodic, loosely connected set of chapters, and that really comes from the stretch goals, which is where we encounter our first big problem. The game's episodic feel comes from these stretch goals, where 2 bonus chapters were funded. Assuming WayForward was working on the game before the Kickstarter, that means we can also assume they weren't really working on these 2 levels because they didn't have the cash, meaning they were spliced in after the fact. It's because of this that the story has that broken down, segmented feel. Each level has its own boss with its own plot, and there's only the faintest hint of a story thread holding it all together, and it really feels pieced together last minute. This touches on what I mentioned earlier about WayForward's misplaced effort. I'm going to have to walk away from the Kickstarter page for a moment and instead look at the game itself. Anyone who's ever played a Shantae game in the past will feel right at home here. It's a bright, colorful game with funny dialogue, and clearly a game that doesn't take itself too seriously. It's full of character, from the unique animations that every character has to the full soundtrack for each level and the funny dialogue. But one area where I think Shantae has always let itself down is the voice acting, or lack thereof. You see these richly drawn and detailed characters, read their backstories, see their unique animations. You can tell they're all bursting with character and they're each individual, and you really want to get to know them better. When you go and talk to them, you expect them to have funny voices, actors really breathing life into them, but that doesn't happen. Instead, when you talk to them, you only get text boxes with little drawings of the characters next to them. It's so deflating because you expect their lines to have the same kind of character as they do, and the same kind of fun animations as their idols, but they don't. What makes it more jarring is the fact that some lines are voiced. You'll be sitting there reading a line, and then when you cycle to the next line, you'll suddenly hear one of the characters, usually Christina V as Shantae, voice a single line, and then it just goes back to silence. Imagine if you were reading a book and came onto the next line, and out of nowhere, someone just reads that line out loud to you, but only that one line, and you don't hear them again for another half hour or so. When you're done locking all the doors and windows and talking to the police, you'll wonder why that person even bothered, and why they didn't just read the whole thing. And that's where we come on to the stretch goals. One of them was for full voice acting at $1.1 million. That really should have been at a lower price. In fact, it should have been part of the base funding. Voice acting is huge in a game driven by an interesting and engaging cast of characters, even in games where the story isn't necessarily all that important. Instead, WayForward prioritized more levels and extra outfits and all that kind of thing, which I think is effort seriously misplaced. Another stretch goal that wasn't met was fully animated cutscenes, which is why we only get those pictures next to the text boxes. Again, same deal, it really feels like that should have been a higher priority than what it was. For whatever reason, WayForward clearly wanted to prioritize DLC and extras above things in the base game, for better or for worse. As far as the overall campaign, that's really all there is to it. Not much in the way of information, as I mentioned in the Kicked episode, but it clearly got the job done. But there's something else to take into consideration. During this campaign, WayForward was also working on another Shantae game, The Pirate's Curse, which they also self-published. Should they have been making one game in the series while simultaneously kickstarting another? It's a fair question to ask, something we've done before with Double Fine and KJ Inafune's company Concept. The question there has been, should a developer run a Kickstarter campaign when they haven't finished their first Kickstarter game yet? And this is along the same lines. It's not a nefarious question necessarily, more of a, wouldn't everyone be better served if you just focused all your effort and money on one game instead of two simultaneously, kind of question. At least Double Fine and Concept could say their games they were working on were totally different. A point-and-click and a turn-based strategy for Double Fine, and a 2D shooter and 3D RPG for Concept. WayForward was working on two nearly identical games within the same franchise. WayForward managed to release both games, but you can't help but wonder if they had to sacrifice anything in either game to make that happen. Or rather, make any sacrifices they wouldn't have otherwise had to have made. Game development, any form of creative expression, is about cutting and rearranging content. I think my editor calls it editing, I think? I don't know, weird. So naturally, they had to cut and change things from both games, as they probably do every game they make. But did they have to cut or change something in one game for the sake of the other, such as they didn't have the time or the money? Now, I haven't played Pirate's Curse, so I can't tell you how that game is, but while playing Half Genie Hero, I couldn't get that question out of my head. HGH is a relatively short game, unless you go out of your way to get 100% completion, which I'm sure many people will do. Logic dictates that surely HGH would have been better if that were the case, but presumably the company was unable to work on one game at a time. Of course, then you wonder about all of WayForward's licensing deals, and you wonder if they could have just done one of those things to make up for it since they were self-publishing both games, but then you're just making wild guesses and theories about a company's business practices and financial situation, and that's reckless, to say the least. Let's just take a look at the game we got and judge it on its own merits. This is indeed very much one for the fans of the franchise. If you ever played a Shantae game before, or even seen a video of one, you'll be right at home. There's no innovation or anything new at all here, really, not that that's necessarily a bad thing. What was pitched on the Kickstarter page is what's in the final game, and that's that. A 2D side-scrolling Metroidvania with a funny story and dialogue and great audio visuals. Now, if you want my opinion, and I don't really know why you would, I think this game is not for me. As you can probably tell by the footage in the background, I suck at it big time. I'm not really one for 2D platformers. I've always been a 3D platformer fan myself because most 2D platformers are all about the challenge, and this game is no exception. At least, I think it is. Difficulty always comes down to the player, it's very subjective, and I remember playing Shovel Knight and thinking it was the hardest game I had played in years, and then reading many commenters thinking that the game was too easy. And this game is a lot like Shovel Knight in that regard, with one key difference. Also, like a lot of 2D platformers, most of that challenge comes from trial and error gameplay. Enemies go down relatively easy, however the jumping and combat mechanics feel a little stiff and floaty, as reviewers like to say. The game requires total precision with its timing on jumps and attacks, to the point where even being a pixel off a platform or a nanosecond off jumping can result in instant death. The auto-scrolling levels in particular demonstrate how rigid the game's mechanics are. Two have you sliding down some kind of conveyor belt automatically, with you only controlling how fast you go, and another has you constantly jumping up on the run from a giant worm. The sliding levels have the typical obstacles in front of you, like holes to jump over and enemies above throwing stuff, and it all comes at you so fast that you have to slow down, meaning you have to travel to the left of the screen. However, barrels slide down behind you as well without warning, and occasionally they can even be obscured by foreground objects, meaning getting hit in this level is inevitable until you memorize the patterns, and a lot of times they can either push you down one of the holes or instantly kill you because you weren't really paying attention to your health meter because you were too busy looking at what's ahead of you. It's a Metroidvania game too, and like many such games, you shouldn't be surprised when you end up getting lost. Or maybe you should be, because there's no map, so you have to memorize each level's layouts. It's not that difficult to be fair, because the levels are pretty small, and they feel smaller with each visit. The checkpoints are sparse though, meaning you're going to have to play through these maze-like levels many times. The thing is, once you do play the game's 5 levels a few times, which you have to do to progress, things completely change. It goes from being a touch too challenging to comically easy. By the time I got to the 5th world, I was effectively immortal, having enough power to buy all the upgrades, max out my health and mana potions, and having enough hearts and magic capabilities it didn't matter anyway. And since I knew the layouts of the map, I didn't have a problem with the platforming either. There's even one power-up that's invincibility, with no drawbacks whatsoever. You pay a one-time small magic fee from your magic reserves or whatever, and then that's it. It's up forever, and you never take any damage from anything, unless you fall off a platform, of course. I know Metroidvanias are all about progressing and making the game a little easier the more you play, but I think this is taking that philosophy a little too far. There are also multiple exploits that you can do, such as using the bat or the harpy transformation to literally fly over whole levels, or transforming into a jug that spits out unlimited money. If you back yourself into a corner the right way, you can use one of the upgrades, the magnet or draw power, to draw the cash into you to effectively give yourself infinite money, something you can do very early on, by the way. I will say the overall production value is high. It's unlikely you'll encounter any bugs, although saying that, I did run into one just as I was finishing this script. I somehow fell through a level, ended up with the camera super zoomed in, and then got stuck in a room somewhere and had to restart. The art is beautifully detailed, and the dialogue is genuinely funny. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but the soundtrack by Jake Kaufman is like pouring liquid orgasm into your ears. Each soundtrack fits perfectly with each level, to the point you don't even realize half the songs are variations of the main tune. If you love the old-school 2D platformers, and of course the Shantae series, then I think you'll love Half Genie Hero. In fact, many reviewers and fans were already saying they're loving it, but of course that doesn't mean the game doesn't have its flaws. On the other hand, if you hate games that are difficult for the sake of being difficult, and where the challenge comes more from trial and error, and games that get super easy towards the end for some reason, then this probably isn't one for you. But you have to give WayForward credit here, despite how much I've been trashing them this video. They did a great job with giving updates over the years, letting backers in on all the extras they had planned and on the game's delays. One notable update came in August 2014, which announced the first delay, but also showed the first gameplay. The footage shown is of the bonus flying carpet mission, and with the exception of a few placeholders more or less, you can easily fill in the details of the final level. It's pretty close to what we got. They even had a couple of votes for things like enemy design, and sure enough, the winning designs are in the game, as well as fan art. The fans are obviously happy, as are backers. The game that was pitched in the Kickstarter all those years ago, as briefly explained as it was, is exactly what was given to us in Shantae Half Genie Hero. This might be the closest I've ever seen a Kickstarter game being one-to-one with the final product, and all that comes down to great planning and knowing what you want to achieve. You can't please everyone, as I'm about to find out when I read the comments to this video, but you can please your longtime fans and Kickstarter backers alike, and that's exactly what WayForward has achieved.